Zen fam, let's talk today about the map of Grand Theft Auto 6. A map that has possibilities and actually, surprisingly enough, not a lot of discussion, or at least nothing substantive. You see, we can go all the way back to the early games that really delved and gave us what we now think of as a sandbox open world game. I mean, you could go back as far as Soul Reaver, although technically that isn't an open world game. It's basically just very large levels that link on each other, while the game basically never has a loading screen. It's continually loading in the background, and it knows roughly where you're going, so it semi-loads where it thinks you're going, and then as you're getting closer, loads more of it, and closer, loads more of it, until you're there and it's loaded it. It's a very clever little game, back in the days of the PS2. Similarly, on the PS2, the game that actually came before Grand Theft Auto 3, and this is a game that crawled so GTA 3 could walk, that would then allow, later down the line, for Grand Theft Auto 5 to run, and for, well, hopefully Grand Theft Auto 6 to fly. You see, what you had back then in State of Emergency was three particular protagonists, bunch of weapons, a relatively decent city, especially for the time, and an open world environment where you could run around and you could interact and you could do all kinds of stuff. You couldn't get into vehicles though, that was one thing. But it was, technically speaking, one of the originators that allowed for Grand Theft Auto 3 to come out in its 3D goodiness, and thus Grand Theft Auto took on the shape that we now best understand it to be. So with that in mind, we now have to look at the map that we might be getting. There are a zillion rumours and only a small handful of videos. Most of the Grand Theft Auto 6 videos that are out there at the minute are all about speculation about when we'll actually get the game and when we'll actually get the trailer, and dealing with people who are putting up fake Grand Theft Auto 6 content online, whether it be AI driven videos or AI driven images and leaks and stuff, and people creating their own ideas of what's going to happen. Some people who have been creating their own models and setting those models in motion and basically making like vertical slice videos of stuff that could be potentially GTA 6 like, and putting it out as, hey, wouldn't it be cool if this was like GTA 6? We get a lot of that kind of content, but nobody's out here like me about to discuss what you're going to get map wise. Now, there has been a lot of initial discussion about the map of 6, that it's going to be Florida based in its topography and set out. There was obviously the talk about being Project Americas, where after time there would be add-ons where the map would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually it would add in the other cities from the rest of the Grand Theft Auto games over the years. You could end up with Los Venturas and Los Santos and San Fierro and Liberty and even Yankton, who knows. But the question then, of course, is how faithful are you to those original cities? I mean, you could do the Grand Theft Auto 4 map quite happily and it would look even more splendid. But you'd run into a problem doing the map from 4 in the presentation of 6. Especially if you have the presentation of the Grand Theft Auto 5 map as part and parcel of Grand Theft Auto 6. Because from what I can see, there's not too much of a change in palette. But the palette choices for 4 are wildly different. It's a much darker, much grittier, much browner game. It's not like that a lot of those games that came out in the PS3 360 generation of the brown shooters and the grey shooters. But there is a darker, heavier tone because it's it's based in a New York type city. So that is reflected in the art style. So it's gonna get interesting to see how the map is actually projected. Will the map change from region to region to region? Will they keep the same sort of graphical style and artistic palette throughout the entire map as they add on to it as years go by, if indeed that is the plan? But the main part for me personally is, if you're going to have this gigantic map, then what are you going to fill it with, and what is going to be the means in which you traverse the space? Because if you're going to have this gigantic map that's going to be, large swaths of a fictionalized North America, then that means you're going to spend a huge amount of time just traveling. And when you're playing Grand Theft Auto 5, whether that be the single player or the multiplayer, the one thing we can all admit right off the bat, that travelling from the bottom of the map in the city to the top of the map to get to the airport or whatever, or be around Sandy Shores, God, that's dull. I mean, it's just fiendishly dull. You're just driving through desert and driving through trees and the cars do this and it's just, yeah, you can put things around and odd little things on the roadside, but then there's a point where that becomes contrived. So how are they going to have this humongous map that covers so much landmass and still make it A, interesting to be in, and B, not a complete slog to travel through? I mean, if you're going to spend 10 minutes travelling from one part of the map to the other, even in a car, that the player is going to get bored. And if you're travelling there for not a very good reason, then the player's going to feel that their time is being devalued. And if there's one thing players like now, is to not feel like their time is being wasted. Especially for older gamers like myself. I mean, my game time is limited. I work 8 hours a day. I travel an hour 40 to work. I travel an hour 40 back from work. When I've got one of my 2 days off a week, generally speaking, I've got household stuff to do. I've got to do things like get shopping in, pay rent, take care of the house, make sure it's not a complete and utter dump, spend time with my kid, try and spend time with my wife, play some video games. God knows it's that's hard enough. And then on top of all that, aside from keeping in touch with all my social media stuff and trying to watch programs and read things and be a human, I'm also making content for you guys. So when I'm playing my video games, I want to make sure that that video game I'm playing respects my time. And that's getting to be a harder and harder proposition as games are getting filled more and more and more with useless, time-wasting bump. So you have to wonder, is having a Gigantomap really the right move? For instance, a few years ago, pre the Big C, I made a video called Grand Theft Auto Edinburgh, where I suggested that a GTA style game like Sleeping Dogs or The Getaway, or any other number of things, OK City. You know how there's all these different games that do all these different things. Basically a Grand Theft Auto clone. There could be a Grand Theft Auto style game set in Edinburgh. Now Edinburgh's not a big city, for anybody who's not from here. I mean, Edinburgh's only something like 7 or 8 miles wide. And it's wider than it's tall. So I would like to believe that an ideal game set here in the capital city of Scotland would be a game where the map would be super high detail. I mean, street for street, beat for beat, building for building, texture mapped, photograph, everything. I mean, full photogrammetry of the entire city. Exactly perfect. I mean, we're talking like better than Microsoft Flight Simulator, with levels of like physical flair that we had when you look at things like, say, The Order 1886 or infamous Second Son. That level of, ooh, that is nice to look at. Proper realism, just for the city. Obviously, you might have to change a couple of things for businesses and stuff to make sure that you don't get sued. Change the names of coffee shops and whatnot. But largely speaking, have Edinburgh as Edinburgh. Now, this has been done here and there in a couple of games over the years. Most notably, I would think of the Forza Horizon series with their Edinburgh map in that big Forza game, which was like basically the entirety of the UK. But it was like, it was very much artistic license. But it was very well done artistic license. No shade on Microsoft, none at all. Because I don't cast shade on the different platforms, because that's just not how I roll. All gaming is good gaming. But a small, tight, beautiful Edinburgh that looks almost indistinguishable from the real thing, aside from a couple of sort of artistic choices. Could really walk up Arthur's Seat. You could really go to the castle. You could properly go down to Porty and splash about. Anything that you could do now in the real actual Edinburgh, pretty much do in a Grand Theft Auto style Edinburgh game. But because it be a smaller map, have a really tight, dense, deep story. Have a game where it's not just the city that's the characters are characters. So many open world games, it's the environment that is actually the primary character. You are just a movement to tell the story of that character, i.e. the city, the map, the world. A bit like being Judge Dredd. So, I like the idea that, like, Grand Theft Auto 6 doesn't actually technically need to be hugiantic. It could actually be smaller. It could be, probably not as small as 4, but not need to be as big as 5. And it could just tell, a more condensed story, a tighter, deeper story surrounding us, a batch of characters in a technically smaller space. I mean, look what they did with Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Now, yes, the San Andreas map is quite large, but you never really bother doing that much stuff in the desert. So you could remove a lot of the desert stuff and still tell a really good story. Because a lot of the good of that story is the relationship between CJ and the various people he meets along the way in his journey from coming back to LS to basically being LS's king, for want of a better term in street slang. He basically was ruling the roost. He was very much the rock star sort of game model of story of rags to riches. And I think such a story would work in an Edinburgh-based game, as I said in that video, which I will obviously try and link in the various places. I'll put a card annotation up, I'll link it in the description, stuff like that. But I think that would be far more beneficial to gamers, to have this beautiful map, this really densely populated, well put together, just visually stunning world where you can actually get lost in it. We don't need to travel an hour and a half to get somewhere. Yeah, there's a reasonable expectation that like you might have to drive say 10 minutes to get somewhere, but that's because the traffic system would have to be navigable. You would have to literally, get in your car at say like, I don't know, like Granton, and make your way to Princess Street, and then get out because you can't drive on Princess Street in a car. Oh, most of it, because most of it's buses and trams and taxis only. So then you'd have to navigate around that, but then it's Grand Theft Auto, so you'd probably go through that in a car and get into a police chase and then have to lose the police, and then get to where you're going, which would then bring about all kinds of game experiences. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about for 6. No need to like have this vast space and hopefully populate it with enough things to see and do, but just have a beautiful environment, a believable environment, an environment that sucks you in visually, which of course adds to the immersion of the game. Once you have that, then tell a really good story, a good chunky rags to riches criminal story, where obviously it will have a surprise ending. I think nobody will see how that game's going to finish up. It'll be a surprise. We'll think we know where we're going, but we won't. So, to my mind, Grand Theft Auto 6 doesn't need to be huge, but it does need to be a spectacle. It does need to be a technical marvel. And I personally think that if that's what happens, then you can add other cities along the way. And you add travel hubs. You jump on a plane and you go there. You jump on a train and you go there. And you don't bother with adding the stuff in between. The wee towns and desert communities and blah blah blah. You just get on a plane and you go there. It worked in San Andreas. You got on a plane in San Fierro, got out the airport, and you were in Los Santos. Now some people will be like, well, that's not very immersive. What if I want to jump out the plane and parachute down and land in a diner in the middle of the desert and shoot up all the patrons and steal the car and then drive the rest of the way back to Vice City? And I'm like, yeah, we've got the power to do that, we've got the ability to do that, but realistically, how much fun is that? After you've killed all the patrons, after you've robbed the restaurant, then you've got, considering how big people are talking about the game being, you could possibly be driving in Grand Theft Auto cars for an hour till you actually hit the city, because obviously they'll scale it down and make it quicker and stuff, but that just doesn't sound fun. And we play video games to escape the drudgery of the real world, to escape ourselves, to escape just reality. So if you come crashing in with the reality of a commute, I think you're going to spoil the essence of GTA and move against basically what gaming is technically for. but I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, please let me know in those comments down below. Typey. Hashtag support Scottish YouTubers, and of course, as always, aye, nae bother.